The iron shackles bit into Samuel's wrists as Catherine Thornwood stood in the doorway of the breeding quarters, her silk gown rustling against the rough pine frame. She was 43 years old, the mistress of Thornwood Hall Plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, and she had come to collect what she believed she owned. Behind her, the overseer held a lantern that cast her shadow across Samuel's face, a shadow that had fallen across him every third night for 11 months. Samuel was 26 years old, 6 feet 8 inches tall, 280 pounds of muscle that had been purchased at auction in New Orleans for $3,200, specifically because Catherine Thornwood wanted children who would be valuable, and her husband Richard had been impotent for 7 years. The breeding had been documented in her personal ledger, kept locked in her escritoire, each encounter marked with a date and a clinical assessment of probability. Samuel had stopped counting after the first month. He had stopped feeling human after the second. But on this night, standing in that doorway behind Catherine, holding a glass of water on a silver tray, was someone Samuel had never seen before. A young woman with Catherine's sharp cheekbones and her father's dark eyes, 17 years old, just returned from finishing school in Charleston, utterly unaware of what her mother had been doing in the quarters behind the main house. Her name was Margaret Thornwood, and when her eyes met Samuel's across that threshold, something shifted in the moral architecture of Thornwood Hall that would eventually burn the entire system to ash. Before we continue this story, and I need you to hear every word of what happens next, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. We're building a community dedicated to telling the stories that the history books erased, the stories that make us uncomfortable because they reveal the full spectrum of what human beings are capable of, both the horror and the transcendence. After you subscribe, comment with the word "remember" and tell me where you're watching from. These stories need to travel. They need to be shared. They need to be remembered, and when you hear what Samuel and Margaret did, when you understand the choice they made and the price they paid, you'll understand why this story matters right now, in this moment in your life. Now, let me take you back to where this began. Samuel was born in 1831 on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, the son of a woman named Esther who had been bred to a man named Jacob, specifically because the plantation owner wanted large field hands. Samuel's size was apparent from childhood. By age 12, he was taller than most grown men. By 15, he was the strongest person on the plantation. And by 18, he had been sold away from his mother for $2,000 to a cotton broker in Memphis who specialized in what the market called premium stock. The broker fed Samuel extra rations, had him exercise with iron weights, and displayed him at auctions across the South with documentation of his lineage, his health, his teeth, his strength. Samuel was sold 3 times between 1849 and 1855, each time for more money, each time to owners who saw him not as a human being, but as a biological investment. In March of 1855, Richard Thornwood attended an estate sale in New Orleans, where Samuel was the featured lot. Richard was 51 years old, the owner of Thornwood Hall, a cotton plantation of 4,000 acres, worked by 237 enslaved people. Richard had inherited the plantation from his father, had married Catherine Beaumont in 1835, and had produced no children in 20 years of marriage. The marriage had become a business arrangement. Catherine managed the house and the domestic slaves. Richard managed the fields and the finances, and they maintained separate bedrooms in opposite wings of the main house. But Catherine wanted an heir. She wanted someone to inherit Thornwood Hall, to carry forward the Thornwood name, and she had become obsessed with the idea that if she could not have children with Richard, she would have them through other means. The law in Mississippi in 1855 was explicit. Children born to enslaved women were the property of the mother's owner, regardless of paternity. This legal framework had created a shadow economy of forced breeding, where enslaved women were raped systematically to produce children who would become property, and where enslaved men were used as studs to create valuable offspring. Catherine Thornwood understood this system perfectly. She had studied the breeding records of neighboring plantations, had calculated the market value of children with certain physical characteristics, and had convinced Richard that purchasing a male slave for breeding purposes would be a sound financial investment. Richard, impotent and indifferent, agreed. He authorized the purchase of Samuel for $3,200, the highest price he had ever paid for a single slave. But Catherine had no intention of breeding Samuel with enslaved women in the quarters. She intended to breed him with herself. The first time it happened was April 14, 1855, 3 weeks after Samuel arrived at Thornwood Hall. Catherine had him brought to a small cabin behind the main house, a structure that had been used for storing tools, but which she had furnished with a bed, a wash basin, and heavy curtains on the windows. The overseer, a man named Douglas Pettigrew, who was paid $1,000 a year and given a house on the property, delivered Samuel to the cabin at 9 o'clock in the evening and locked the door from the outside. Catherine arrived at 9:30 wearing a dressing gown, carrying a lamp. She did not speak to Samuel as a person. She gave him instructions as though he were a piece of equipment. She told him what to do, how to do it, and when to stop. When it was finished, she left without looking at him. Pettigrew unlocked the door at midnight and took Samuel back to the quarters. This pattern continued every third night for 11 months. Catherine kept meticulous records in her ledger: dates, durations, physical observations. She consulted medical texts about conception, adjusted timing based on her monthly cycles, and treated the entire process as a scientific experiment. Samuel was given extra food to maintain his strength, was excused from the hardest field labor to preserve his value, and was forbidden from speaking to anyone about what happened in the cabin. Pettigrew enforced this silence with the threat of sale to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where the mortality rate was 70% within 5 years. Samuel understood that resistance would mean death or something worse than death. He endured. But Catherine did not conceive. Month after month, her body refused to produce the heir she wanted. By March of 1856, she had begun to suspect that the problem was not Samuel's fertility, but her own age. She was 43 years old, past the prime years of childbearing, and her desperation was turning into rage. She increased the frequency of the sessions, demanded longer durations, and began to blame Samuel for her failure. The psychological torture of being used as an object, of being reduced to a biological function, of being blamed for outcomes he could not control, was destroying Samuel's sense of self. He began to dissociate during the sessions, to retreat into a mental space where he could observe what was happening to his body without being present in it. He stopped speaking even when he was allowed to speak. He moved through the days like a ghost. And then Margaret came home. Margaret Thornwood had been sent to Charleston at age 14 to attend a finishing school for daughters of wealthy Southern families. She had spent 3 years learning French, piano, watercolor painting, and the social graces expected of a plantation mistress. She had been sheltered from the realities of slavery, educated in a world where enslaved people were invisible servants whose suffering was never discussed. She returned to Natchez in March of 1856 with romantic notions about plantation life, with dreams of balls and suitors and a gracious existence. She had no idea what her mother had been doing. She had no idea that the system she had been taught to see as natural and benevolent was built on rape, torture, and commodified human flesh. Margaret met Samuel on her 3rd day home. She had gone to the kitchen to ask the cook about dinner preparations and had seen Samuel through the window, working in the vegetable garden behind the house. She was struck immediately by his size, by the way he moved with careful precision despite his massive frame, by something in his face that seemed both absent and intensely present. She asked the cook who he was. The cook, a woman named Dinah who had been enslaved at Thornwood Hall for 30 years, hesitated before answering. She said his name was Samuel. She said he was new. She said nothing else, but her silence carried a weight that Margaret did not yet understand. Margaret began to notice Samuel everywhere. He was assigned to tasks near the main house, repairing fences, hauling firewood, tending the gardens, and she realized that this was unusual. Most field hands worked in the cotton fields from dawn until dusk and were never seen near the family's living quarters. She asked her mother why Samuel was different. Catherine's response was curt. Samuel was valuable property being preserved for breeding purposes. Margaret, still naive, assumed this meant breeding with enslaved women to produce children who would work the fields. She did not question further, but on the night of April 11th, 1856, Margaret could not sleep. She had been reading in her room and had lost track of time, and at 9:30 she decided to go to the kitchen for warm milk. She left her room, walked down the back stairs, and past a window that overlooked the rear grounds. Through that window she saw her mother walking towards the small cabin behind the house, carrying a lamp. She saw the overseer unlock the door. She saw her mother enter. She saw the door close and the lock turn. Margaret stood at that window for 3 hours. She watched the lamp glow through the curtained windows. She watched her mother emerge at midnight, adjust her dressing gown, and walk back to the main house without speaking to the overseer. She watched the overseer unlock the cabin and lead Samuel out. Watched Samuel walk with his head down toward the quarters. Watched the overseer lock the cabin and return to his own house. And Margaret understood. The next morning, Margaret confronted her mother in the parlor. She demanded to know what was happening in the cabin. Catherine, caught off guard, initially tried to deflect, but Margaret's fury was too intense to dismiss. Catherine finally admitted the truth. She had been using Samuel to try to conceive a child, an heir for Thornwood Hall, because Richard could not give her one. She explained it as a business decision, a rational response to a practical problem. She used the language of property and investment. She showed Margaret the ledger with its clinical entries. She expected Margaret to understand, to accept, to see it as Catherine saw it, as a necessary adaptation within the system they inhabited. Margaret was horrified. She had been raised to see enslaved people as inferior, as naturally suited to servitude, but she had also been taught Christian morality, had been educated in literature that celebrated love and virtue, had absorbed enough Enlightenment philosophy to believe in human dignity as an abstract concept. The collision between these worldviews, between the dehumanization required by slavery and the moral framework she had been taught, shattered something in Margaret's understanding of her world. She saw her mother as a rapist. She saw the system as evil, and she saw Samuel as a human being who had been tortured for 11 months while she had been learning to paint watercolors in Charleston. Margaret demanded that the session stop immediately. Catherine refused. She said Samuel was her property, that she had the legal right to use him as she saw fit, that Margaret was a child who did not understand the responsibilities of managing a plantation. The argument escalated into a screaming confrontation that brought Richard into the parlor. When Richard learned what Catherine had been doing, he was not outraged by the rape. He was outraged by the deception, by the fact that Catherine had been using his property without his explicit ongoing consent, by the potential scandal if the truth became public. He did not care about Samuel's suffering. He cared about his reputation and his control. Richard made a decision. The breeding program would stop, not because it was morally wrong, but because it had failed to produce results and was now creating family conflict. Samuel would be reassigned to field labor. Catherine would abandon her obsession with an heir. The matter would be closed. But Margaret could not close it. She could not unsee what she had seen, could not unknow what she now knew. She began to watch Samuel during the day, to observe him working in the fields, to notice the way he moved as though his body were a burden he carried, rather than a self he inhabited. She began to feel a responsibility, a need to acknowledge what had been done to him, to offer some form of recognition that he was human, that he had been wronged, that his suffering mattered. In May of 1856, Margaret did something that violated every social rule of her world. She spoke to Samuel directly without an overseer present, treating him as a person rather than as property. She found him alone in the barn, repairing a harness, and she approached him with her heart pounding. She said, "I know what my mother did to you. I'm sorry." Samuel did not respond. He did not look at her. He continued working on the harness as though she had not spoken. Margaret stood there for a long moment, then turned and left. But she came back the next day, and the day after that. She brought him food from the kitchen, cornbread, ham, apples, and left it on the workbench without speaking. She brought him a book, a copy of Frederick Douglass's narrative that she had found hidden in her father's library, and left it wrapped in cloth where he would find it. She began to create a space where Samuel could exist as something other than an object, where he could be seen. It took 3 weeks before Samuel spoke to her. He said, "Why are you doing this?" His voice was deep, rough from disuse, and Margaret realized it was the first time she had heard him speak. She said, "Because what happened to you was wrong, and I need you to know that I see that." Samuel looked at her then, really looked at her and said, "Your seeing it doesn't change it." Margaret said, "I know. But maybe it changes what happens next." What happened next was that they began to talk, carefully, in stolen moments when no one was watching, in the barn or the garden or the edge of the woods. Margaret asked Samuel about his life, his mother, his memories of Virginia. Samuel slowly began to answer. He told her about Esther, about being sold away, about the auctions and the examinations and the years of being treated as livestock. He told her about the cabin, about the dissociation, about the way he had learned to survive by becoming absent from himself. And Margaret listened with a horror that was also a kind of awakening, a realization that everything she had been taught about the world was a lie designed to protect her from the truth of what her comfort was built upon. They fell in love slowly, over months of conversation and shared silence, over the recognition that they were both trapped in a system that deformed everyone it touched. Margaret was trapped by her gender, by the expectation that she would marry a man her father chose and become a decorative manager of a household built on suffering. Samuel was trapped by his race, by the legal fiction that he was property rather than a person, by the constant threat of violence and sale. Their love was an act of mutual recognition, a refusal to accept the categories that the world imposed on them. But love, in that context, was also impossibly dangerous. Mississippi law in 1856 made it illegal for white women to have sexual relationships with black men, enslaved or free. The penalty for a black man accused of such a relationship was death, usually by lynching. The penalty for a white woman was social death, expulsion from her family, loss of all property rights, permanent disgrace. And the penalty for an enslaved person who tried to escape with a white woman was not just death, but torture designed to serve as a public warning. Margaret and Samuel both understood these realities. They understood that their love had no future within the system they inhabited, so they decided to destroy the system, at least the part of it they could reach. In August of 1856, Margaret began to plan their escape. She had access to her father's library, to maps and newspapers and abolitionist literature that Richard kept locked away but which she had learned to access. She studied the routes that escaped slaves used to reach the North, the networks of safe houses and sympathetic conductors, the risks and the strategies. She learned about the Underground Railroad, about Harriet Tubman's routes through Maryland, about the communities of free black people in Philadelphia and Boston who helped fugitives establish new lives. She learned that the journey from Mississippi to freedom was nearly 1,000 miles, that it required money and documents and luck, that the odds of success were low and the consequences of failure were death. Margaret had one advantage. She had access to money. Her grandmother had left her a trust fund of $5,000 held in a bank in New Orleans, which she would inherit when she turned 18 or when she married, whichever came first. Margaret's 18th birthday was September 14, 1856. She planned to claim the money, convert it to gold, and use it to fund their escape. But she needed Samuel's cooperation, and Samuel was not sure he could survive hope. He had been broken too thoroughly, had learned too well that hope was a luxury that enslaved people could not afford. When Margaret first proposed the plan, Samuel refused. He said, "They'll kill us both. You'll die because of me." Margaret said, "I'll die anyway, slowly, if I stay here and pretend this is normal. At least this way I'll die trying to be free." It took Margaret 2 weeks to convince Samuel that the plan was possible. She showed him the maps, the money, the documents she had forged that identified them as a white woman traveling with her hired servant. She explained that they would travel by riverboat to Memphis, then by train to Cincinnati, then on foot through Ohio to Cleveland, where they could board a ship to Canada. She had contacted through coded letters a Quaker family in Cincinnati who operated a station on the Underground Railroad and who had agreed to shelter them. She had thought through every detail, every contingency, every risk. Samuel finally agreed, not because he believed they would succeed, but because he realized that Margaret was going to try with or without him, and he could not let her face that danger alone. They set the date for September 20th, 1856, 6 days after Margaret's birthday. The plan required precise timing and multiple coordinated actions. First, Margaret would travel to New Orleans with her mother on September 15th, ostensibly to shop for her birthday. While there, she would visit the bank, claim her inheritance, and convert it to gold coins that she could carry. She would tell her mother she wanted to donate some of the money to the church and needed it in cash. Second, Samuel would be assigned to accompany them to New Orleans as a driver and bodyguard, a role that Richard had recently given him because of his size and strength. This would place Samuel in the city at the right time without raising suspicion. Third, on the evening of September 19th, Margaret would tell her mother she was feeling ill and wanted to return to the hotel early. She would leave the social event they were attending, return to the hotel, change into traveling clothes, and meet Samuel at the riverfront. Fourth, they would board a steamboat departing for Memphis at midnight, using the forged documents and the gold to purchase passage. Once on the boat, they would be anonymous travelers in a crowd of merchants and migrants. Fifth, they would follow the route to Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Canada, using the Underground Railroad network and Margaret's money to buy safety where they could and to bribe officials where they had to. The plan depended on speed, on getting far enough away before anyone realized they were gone, on crossing state lines before the alarm could be raised. It depended on Margaret's ability to lie convincingly to her mother, on Samuel's ability to move through white spaces without attracting suspicion, on the willingness of strangers to help them despite the risks. It was a plan with 1,000 points of failure. But on September 15th, 1856, Margaret and Samuel traveled to New Orleans with Catherine Thornwood, and the plan began. Margaret claimed her inheritance without difficulty. The bank manager, a man named Howard Prescott, who had known her grandmother, congratulated her on reaching adulthood and asked how she planned to use the money. Margaret said she wanted to support missionary work and needed the funds in portable form. Prescott converted $4,000 to gold coins, 40-pound weight in double eagles and eagles, and gave her a leather satchel to carry them. Margaret kept $500 in paper currency for immediate expenses and deposited the remaining $500 back into the account to avoid suspicion. Over the next 4 days, Margaret and Catherine attended social events, visited shops, and maintained the appearance of a normal birthday trip. Samuel stayed in the background, driving the carriage, carrying packages, and being invisible in the way that enslaved people had learned to be invisible in white spaces. But every night, after Catherine was asleep, Margaret and Samuel met in the hotel's service stairwell and reviewed the plan, checking details, rehearsing contingencies, and drawing strength from each other's presence. On the evening of September 19th, Catherine and Margaret attended a ball at the home of a cotton broker named Edmund Fairfax. The event was crowded with wealthy planters and their families, with music and dancing and elaborate displays of wealth. Margaret danced with several young men whose fathers wanted to arrange marriages, smiled and made conversation, and waited for her moment. At 10 o'clock, she told her mother she had a headache and wanted to return to the hotel. Catherine, annoyed but not suspicious, allowed her to leave with Samuel as escort. They returned to the hotel. Margaret went to her room, changed into a simple traveling dress, packed a small bag with essential items, and took the satchel of gold. She left a note for her mother on the bed. "I cannot live in a world built on the suffering of others. I am leaving to find a different way to be human. Do not look for me. I am already gone." She met Samuel in the alley behind the hotel at 11 o'clock. They walked together through the dark streets of New Orleans to the riverfront, where the steamboat Northern Star was preparing to depart for Memphis. Margaret approached the ticket office, presented her forged documents identifying her as Mrs. Margaret Ashford, traveling with her servant, and purchased 2 tickets, one first-class cabin for herself, one deck passage for Samuel. The clerk barely looked at the documents. He took her money, gave her the tickets, and waved them towards the gangplank. They boarded the Northern Star at 11:40. The boat departed at midnight, its paddle wheel churning the dark water of the Mississippi, carrying them away from Natchez, away from Thornwood Hall, away from the only world either of them had ever known. For the first 2 days they traveled without incident. Margaret stayed in her cabin, playing the role of a genteel widow traveling north. Samuel stayed on the deck with the other servants and enslaved people being transported by their owners, invisible and unremarkable. They did not speak to each other in public. They communicated through brief glances, through the small gestures that people who love each other learn to read. But on the 3rd day, September 22nd, a passenger named Thomas Whitfield recognized Margaret. Whitfield was a planter from Natchez who had attended the ball at Edmund Fairfax's house, who had seen Margaret there, and who knew she was the daughter of Richard Thornwood. He approached her on the deck and said, "Miss Thornwood, what a surprise to see you here. Is your mother with you?" Margaret's heart stopped. She said, "I'm traveling alone on family business." Whitfield said, "Alone? That's unusual for a young lady. Does your father know?" Margaret said, "Of course. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm not feeling well." She retreated to her cabin, locked the door, and tried to think. Whitfield was suspicious. He had heard rumors about Margaret's birthday trip, knew that Catherine had returned to Natchez 2 days earlier, and realized that something was wrong. He went to the boat's captain, a man named James Holloway, and expressed his concerns. Holloway, wary of legal trouble, decided to investigate. He knocked on Margaret's cabin door and asked to see her travel documents. Margaret showed him the forged papers, Holloway examined them, noted the name Ashford rather than Thornwood, and said, "These documents appear irregular. I'll need to verify your identity when we reach Memphis." Margaret knew they were caught. She knew that when the boat docked in Memphis, Holloway would contact the authorities, that her identity would be confirmed, that Samuel would be arrested, and she would be returned to her father. They had perhaps 12 hours before the boat reached Memphis. They had to act. That night at 2 in the morning, Margaret left her cabin and found Samuel on the deck. She told him what had happened. Samuel said, "We jump, we swim to shore, and we run." They were somewhere north of Vicksburg, in a remote stretch of the river with dense forest on both banks. The water was cold, the current was strong, and the distance to shore was at least 200 yards. But it was their only chance. They waited until the deck was empty, until the crew was focused on navigation and the passengers were asleep. At 3:15 in the morning, they climbed over the rail together, held hands for one moment, and jumped into the black water of the Mississippi River. The cold was a shock that drove the air from their lungs. The current pulled them downstream, away from the boat, tumbling them in the darkness. Margaret could not swim well. She had learned in calm ponds, not in rivers, and the weight of her dress was dragging her under. Samuel grabbed her, held her head above water, and kicked toward the western shore. The satchel of gold was tied to Margaret's waist, 40 pounds of weight that was pulling her down, but she refused to let it go. They needed that money to survive. It took them 20 minutes to reach the shore, 20 minutes of fighting the current and the cold and the exhaustion. They crawled onto a muddy bank, gasping and shaking, and collapsed in the darkness. Behind them, the lights of the Northern Star disappeared around a bend in the river. They were somewhere in the wilderness of western Mississippi, soaking wet with no shelter and no clear idea of where they were. But they were alive, and they were together, and they were free. They walked north through the forest for 3 days, following the river at a distance, hiding during the day and traveling at night. They had no food except what they could forage: wild berries, roots, water from streams. Margaret's feet blistered and bled. Samuel carried her when she could not walk. They slept in hollow logs and under dense brush, always listening for the sound of dogs or horses or men. On the 4th day, they reached a small settlement near the Mississippi-Tennessee border. Margaret used some of the gold to buy food, clothes, and information from a free black man who ran a general store. The man, whose name was Isaiah Grant, recognized them for what they were, runaways, and told them that slave catchers were active in the area, that a reward had been posted for a white woman and a large black man traveling together, that the amount was $1,000. Grant said, "You need to get off the river route. They're watching every town between here and Memphis." He gave them directions to a farm 15 miles east, run by a Quaker family named Patterson, who were known to help fugitives. He said, "Tell them Isaiah sent you. They'll know what that means." They reached the Patterson farm on the evening of September 27th. The family, Elias and Ruth Patterson, and their 3 adult children, took them in without hesitation, fed them, gave them clean clothes, and let them sleep in a hidden room beneath the barn. Elias Patterson was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a man who had helped more than 60 people escape to freedom over the past decade. He told Margaret and Samuel that their route to Canada was compromised, that they needed to travel east through Tennessee and Kentucky rather than north through the river towns, that the journey would take at least a month and would require moving through some of the most dangerous territory in the South. Margaret and Samuel stayed with the Pattersons for 5 days, recovering their strength and planning the next stage of the journey. Ruth Patterson taught Margaret how to disguise herself as a poor farmer's wife, how to walk and talk and carry herself in ways that would not attract attention. Elias taught Samuel how to navigate by the stars, how to read the landscape for safe paths, how to avoid patrols and checkpoints. And the Patterson children gathered supplies: food, blankets, a pistol with ammunition, maps marked with safe houses and danger zones. On October 2nd, Margaret and Samuel left the Patterson farm and began the overland journey to freedom. They traveled through the hill country of Tennessee, through small towns and isolated farms, through forests and swamps and river crossings. They moved from safe house to safe house, guided by the network of abolitionists and free black communities who risked their lives to help fugitives. They were sheltered by a black preacher in Nashville, by a German immigrant family in Lexington, by a community of Quakers in Cincinnati. Each time they were fed, hidden, and sent forward with directions to the next station. The journey took 43 days. They walked more than 600 miles. They crossed rivers in the dark, hid in barns and cellars and caves, and passed through towns where wanted posters with their descriptions were nailed to every wall. They were nearly caught twice, once by a patrol in Kentucky that stopped them on a road and questioned their documents, and once by a slave catcher in southern Ohio who recognized Samuel's size and became suspicious. Both times they escaped through a combination of Margaret's quick thinking, Samuel's physical presence, and the intervention of allies who created diversions or provided false information. On November 14, 1856, they reached Cleveland, Ohio. They had crossed into free territory, but they were not yet safe. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that slave catchers could operate in free states, that Samuel could be arrested and returned to Mississippi even in Ohio. They needed to reach Canada. They boarded a ship called the Lake Erie Crossing on November 16th, using the last of Margaret's gold to purchase passage to Toronto. The ship departed at dawn on November 17th, and by sunset, they could see the Canadian shore. When they stepped onto the dock in Toronto on November 18, 1856, they were legally free for the first time in their lives. They settled in a community of formerly enslaved people in Toronto, a neighborhood where hundreds of fugitives had built new lives. Margaret used the remaining gold to rent a small house, to buy tools and supplies, to establish a modest existence. Samuel found work as a blacksmith, using skills he had learned on the plantation to earn wages for the first time in his life. Margaret began teaching reading and writing to children in the community, using the education she had received in Charleston to serve people who had been denied education by law. They married in a small ceremony at a black church in Toronto on December 25, 1856. The marriage was illegal in Mississippi, would have been punishable by death in Mississippi, but in Canada it was simply a marriage. Two people choosing to build a life together. They lived in Toronto for the rest of their lives. They had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, who grew up free, who attended school, who never knew the terror of being property. Samuel became a leader in the community, helping other fugitives establish themselves, teaching young men trades and serving as a deacon in the church. Margaret wrote a memoir of their escape, published in 1870 under the title From Bondage to Freedom. A true account of love and resistance, which became one of the most widely read slave narratives of the Reconstruction era. The memoir was explicit about Catherine Thornwood's crimes, about the rape and the breeding program, and it became evidence in the broader abolitionist argument that slavery was not just an economic system, but a moral atrocity built on sexual violence and dehumanization. Richard and Catherine Thornwood never recovered from the scandal. When Margaret's memoir was published, it destroyed their social standing in Natchez. Catherine became a recluse, dying in 1875 of what the death certificate called melancholia. Richard lost much of his wealth during the Civil War when Union forces occupied Natchez and freed the people he had enslaved. Thornwood Hall was sold in 1868 to pay debts. The plantation was eventually subdivided and sold to formerly enslaved families during Reconstruction. Samuel died in 1903 at the age of 72, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His obituary in the Toronto newspaper described him as a man of extraordinary strength and character who escaped from slavery and built a life of dignity and service. Margaret died in 1911 at the age of 72. Her obituary called her a woman of courage who chose love over comfort and freedom over safety. Their story raises questions that we still struggle with today. What does it mean to love across lines of power that are designed to make love impossible? What does it cost to choose freedom when freedom requires leaving behind everything you know? How do we honor the people who resisted systems of oppression, not through grand political gestures, but through the intimate, dangerous act of recognizing each other's humanity? Margaret and Samuel's story is not a romance in the conventional sense. It is a story about two people who were trapped in a system that tried to reduce them both to functions, Margaret to a decorative object, Samuel to a breeding animal, and who refused that reduction. Their love was not a solution to the problem of slavery. It was an act of resistance, a refusal to accept the categories that the world imposed on them, a choice to see each other as fully human in a context that denied humanity to both of them in different ways. The historical record preserves their story in Margaret's memoir, in church records from Toronto, in census documents that list their children, and in the archives of the abolitionist movement that used their story as evidence of slavery's moral bankruptcy. But the deeper record is in the lives they built, in the children they raised free, in the community they served, and in the choice they made to risk everything for the possibility of being human together. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have had the courage to walk away from wealth and safety to stand with someone the world told you was property? What would you have done in Samuel's position? Would you have been able to hope again after 11 months of being used as an object? Comment below with your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about power and love and resistance in new ways, share it. These stories need to travel. They need to be told. They need to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We're building a community dedicated to recovering the stories that the history books erased, the stories that challenge our assumptions about the past and about ourselves. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And remember, the past is not dead. It's not even past. The systems that Margaret and Samuel fought against, systems that reduce people to functions, that deny humanity based on race or gender or class, are still with us in different forms. Their story is not just history, it's a mirror, it's a question, it's a challenge. What are you going to do with it?